We are live.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Social Services Committee for Wednesday, April 9th. And clerk, has the roll been taken?
Through the chair, the roll has been taken.
All right. And at this time, we'll ask if there are any declarations of conflict of interest for any items appearing on the agenda today. Okay, seeing none. At this time, I'll ask members if there are any items the committee wishes to separate for discussion purposes, noting that 5.1 is already separated as we have a presentation. Okay, then can I have a mover and a seconder to place all of the items for consideration and consent on the floor? Okay, so Councillor McCurry and Councillor Oakley, thank you. And clerk, can you please call the vote on everything that's not separated?
The item subject to the vote is item 6.1, point in time count 2024, and the minutes from March 5th. All those in favor? And that carries. Thank you.
All right, and so with that, we have one presentation from Mike Lutby Consultants regarding item 5.1, achieving functional zero in the city of Brantford and the county of Grant. At this time, I'll call on Mike Lutby from Lutby Consultants to make a presentation on item 5.1, achieving functional zero in the city of Brantford and the county of Grant. Lutby Consultant report. You have 10 minutes inclusive of question. You will have 10 minutes for your presentation, and questions will be held until we discuss the item. Go ahead.
Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me in today. Excited to be talking about this report. So I was just a little about myself. First off, I've been working in the homelessness sector for about 20 years. The majority of that is an executive director of a youth program in the Niagara region called the Raft. When I started, the Raft was a shelter. It was a 10-bed shelter. Within a year, we expanded to 24 beds, and the shelter was instantly full. And we thought that was the solution, was just adding beds. And this has typically been the solution across Canada. Whenever beds end up getting full, we just look to build bigger and bigger shelters. What I realized is that we couldn't continue to just build shelters if we actually wanted to achieve our goal of ending homelessness. Building shelters was only causing it to increase. And so we started on a path of prevention, working with people in communities, and specifically the communities around the city of St. Catharines, which is the main urban center in Niagara. That's where all the services were. So we would have people coming in from Fort Erie and smaller rural communities to access the shelter simply because we put the shelter in the city. And so by working with the communities, we were able to prevent people from having to come into the shelter. And over the years, we've seen a reduction of about 80% in the number of people coming to our shelter, which is significant. It went from just over 500 individual youth accessing our shelter in any one year down to about 140. Since then, we've added additional programs. One is a shelter diversion program, which we've seen great success with. This program alone allowed us this year for the Niagara region to actually close its second new shelter because there was no need for it, which is pretty remarkable in this time in Canada that we were actually able to close a shelter, not because there wasn't funding for the shelter, but because there just weren't people to utilize the beds. And since we've closed that shelter, the Raft shelter continues to operate at about 60% capacity. So even with that shelter closed, we're still not operating at 100%. We're operating about 60%. And so the reason why I explain all this this backstory on myself is just so you understand philosophically and programmatically where I'm coming from when I'm making my recommendations. I'm not a proponent of expanding shelters. I'm very much a proponent of working in community to address needs before it gets to the point where people have to use shelter. And I think if we continue to just add shelters, we're really, any investment in shelters without investments in prevention and housing supports is really just an investment in homelessness. So if you're buying it, you're going to receive it. And that's ultimately what happens when you purchase just shelters, is you're just purchasing more homelessness. So just to kind of, that is sort of the reasoning behind how I think about the work we do. And obviously that filters into the recommendations that I'm making for this report. When we look at, to get out of Niagara now and to actually look at Brantford, I'll say first off the top, I don't work with a lot of communities. This isn't my full-time job being a consultant, but it gives me the ability to work with the communities that I think actually have the ability to get the work done. And right off the top, Brantford is one of those communities. You have all the resources contained within your community to get the job done, to see real reductions in homelessness. And some of that is because you've already started some of the big work. We're not starting from scratch in Brantford. The work has already been happening. It's been happening for at least 5 years, with a significant investment in the last contract round, where you've now introduced a standardized shelter diversion. And so this gives me, like, you're in a really good place to be able to implement, because you're not starting from a place where you're having to develop all these things. This is really, and this is why I sort of called it a realignment, because really what we're doing is we're taking things that already exist and just sort of moving them into alignment in order to achieve your goal of reaching functional zero. Functional zero, very simply, is that if more people come into your shelter system than leave your shelter system, that's going to increase your numbers. And so we want to flip that. We want less people coming into shelter than the people who are leaving shelter. That'll decrease your shelter. And ultimately, if you're able to maintain that, you'll get to a situation where you won't require as many shelters. That's really what functional zero means. So it's just a way of thinking about very plainly, what do shelters do, and how do people move through shelters, and then what does that mean for your larger homelessness issue. So that's what we're trying to achieve when we say we're looking to achieve functional zero. We want at least as many people, minimum, leaving shelter as enter shelter, and ideally we want less people entering shelter than are leaving. We want more people leaving. If we can do this over months, you'll see a drastic reduction in the number of homelessness. So this is the goal that this report seek to sort of align existing work that's happening in the community, build on success, build on the traditions, respect the work that has already happened and the community partners that already exist. And so that really went in. And then I'm a fiscal conservative when it comes to how I do my planning. And so I also look at, I don't like to add things if I think we can sort of utilize money that's already being spent more effectively. And so that's a critical piece of this report, is that there may be a time where we want to add something, but let's make sure that the money we're currently spending is actually achieving the goals that we think it is achieving. And only then do we look to add any new programming. And so that's part of also captured in the report and in my recommendations. The hardest part of achieving anything that's in this report is going to be community buy-in. That'll be the hardest part of achieving functional zero, is moving the community along in order to align everyone with the common goal of functional zero. Without willing players in the community, achieving functional zero will be very difficult. And we'll get into a little bit where there might be those touch points that are difficult, potential difficulties. Doesn't have to be difficult, but the complication, nothing I'm suggesting is complex. However, everything I'm suggesting is potentially complicated, because as soon as we bring in people into the mix, we create complications, even if it's the simplest of processes. And so the first thing I'd sort of like to look at, and the way I've arranged these, the first couple I'd say are probably the most important, and that they're potentially the points where it could become very complicated. And so the largest one is really understanding what actually causes homelessness. And for most people, if you look, we talk a lot about mental health, addictions, housing crisis. In the 20 years that I've been doing my work, nothing has actually changed. This has always been the things that people sort of ascribe to why homelessness is increasing. And it also prevents us from doing some of the work because we think, well, we need to deal with this issue before we can deal with the housing issue. And so by slowing this process down, we allow people to remain in homelessness longer, which then obviously increases the amount of time that people are accessing shelter beds. And then again, we get back to the non-functional zero, or we're basically holding spaces, and then people are sort of piling up. We're warehousing people. And so when we start looking at the reality for most Canadians, homelessness is about 1% of the entire population at any one time on any given night is homeless. So 99% of Canadians are somehow managing to be housed. This isn't true for how many people at risk of homelessness. There are many more people at risk of homelessness, but only a small percentage of the people at risk of homelessness become homeless. And the key reason is because the majority of Canadians are able to leverage family and friends and community. And so if you think, so I asked that question, if you yourself found out that for whatever reason you couldn't return home tonight, where would you go? And I would say that very few people would say I'd go to my homeless shelter. There's a family, there's a friend, there's an associate that you would most likely, and that's how most Canadians end up not being homeless. They don't even realize that they're at risk of homelessness because it's so obvious that they'd move home, or they'd move in with a friend or stay on the couch until they're able to sort of figure out whatever the housing crisis was that they found themselves in. And so the group that really then becomes homeless is the group that, for whatever reason, is prevented from leveraging their social connections. And until we start addressing that issue in the system, that reality, we really won't be able to make large dents in the homeless population broadly. And so when you think about how the current system operates, we're very transactional.
Sorry, Michael, just pause you just for a second. I need to find out if the committee would like to
Can I go
extend the period of time, as we're just at just over 10 minutes.
Sorry.
Yep, so moved by Councillor Bell and seconded by Mayor Davis. All in favor?
I apologize. I will I'll get through this.
Sorry, 10 minutes again, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and you can proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, I apologize I'll get through this. The shelter system itself is very transactional. This is largely how systems are how we deliver systems in Canada. It's a market system, so we're very good and very comfortable to be able to hand out things. So if you need a bed, we supply a bed. If you need food, we supply food. If you need your rent, we provide a rent income. What we really don't do in the system is do social work. And that's really what I'm saying. Every program needs to now sort of look at itself and see what is the social aspect of the work we're doing and how are we having an impact. It can't just be about providing things. We need to work with people as people. And significantly, professional relationships end. Natural relationships are for life. And so your mom doesn't stop being your mom because it became 5 o'clock and she went home. Where your worker who you rely on will go home and you'll have to wait till they come back to work. So that's the significant part of the first theme, is really understanding the relationship that social supports play in causing homelessness, and being able to start addressing that. The second one, which again is could be somewhat difficult, is realigning to become housing focused. And now, when I talk to most people in the community who aren't involved in homelessness, they just assume that we are housing focused, because isn't that the whole point of the homeless system? However, we largely haven't been housing focused. And what I mean by housing focused is that the outcome we're looking to achieve is to move people rapidly and successfully from shelter into housing. Typically, what we currently do, people come in, we largely try and let people self-resolve. We try and look and connect them to all kinds of different programs that potentially could be on offer. And that takes away our focus from housing. And so when we're looking at housing focus, significantly what we're trying to do is that We understand that the people accessing our shelter are the people who we assume the shelter was built for. And so this is people that are in an emergency, and much like an accident, an emergency shelter, emergency homeless means that it was non-preventable and sudden. And so we need to make sure that we're doing this, where the work with your shelter diversion program, that's really how that supports, to make sure that the people accessing shelter are the people we think the shelter is built for and is designed for. That's critical. The second one is we have to assume that people coming into our shelter are responsible for working actively towards securing their housing. The shelter itself is not a successful housing outcome. And so we need to make sure that people understand, just by coming in the shelter, that is not housing. And that the expectation is that people will move out of shelter actively. And then finally, the shelter itself needs to be responsible to its own mandate to make sure that it's supporting in every way possible to move people successfully from the shelter back into the community. So that's largely what the housing focus shelter provides. Direct service, this is a relatively new development since the COVID. A number of municipalities have, because of their work in isolation shelters, have started doing more work in direct service delivery, where primarily, traditionally, it was largely contracted to the not-for-profit. And so I bring this up because there may be opportunities, and there are opportunities utilizing current staffing to realign some of their job positions, because they're already doing the work, to just ask a few more questions, which could have a great impact on homelessness, specifically with families. And then the question becomes, again, on the money question, it may cost, you may pay more for service, but if the service isn't providing, then the money is wasted anyways. And so it really comes down to a return on investment, where you need to look, what are we paying for, and are we achieving the outcomes we're looking? And then if we're not, then is there a better way? And so that's largely the discussion around direct service provision. Expanding, and I kind of hit this, being able to support the larger rural community, the county of Brant that surrounds. I know there's always going to be a push to open emergency shelter in the smaller communities. I would not recommend that this be the first thing that you look at. Again, it'll be expensive and you won't win any friends, because wherever you put that shelter, you're going to create animosity in that community. And so utilizing existing services that already support the community, we can look to do outreach and provide people that are known contacts in the community. So the key there is just to make sure that the services that are provided are known and available, and then would have people reach out in the community as opposed to having to come into the city in order to access shelter. And so that's largely would be my recommendation for working with the county, not to open shelter, but to first start seeing if there's better ways that you can engage in the community to help support people in the community. And again, if you think back to the social question, if people have to leave their community in order to come into the city, you're also removing them from their natural supports, and they have to start over. And unless they can return back, likely their homelessness will be prolonged by that. Finally, there are certain populations within the larger homeless population, which I think either because of the statistics that we have on it, because of traditional work that the community has done with this population, or opportunity, deserve potentially some attention and could further your goal. And I've sort of identified some, the Indigenous and First Nations, specifically for the city of Brantford, is a critical population. You'll have your pick count coming up after me, where we see there's a much higher than what you would expect level of Indigenous identified homelessness in the city through the pick count. And so this really requires working with the community, because Indigenous really is a nation within a nation. And so working with the community to identify ways that we could do better to support the Indigenous identifying people in your city, which really will come down to working with people. It's not so much the city needs to deliver different programming, but it really will come down to working with the members of that community to identify what their needs are and how they want to address them. Secondly is youth. which is already, you're doing great work. You have a long history of supporting youth work in homelessness. And so really it's about continually doing that work and recognizing that youth are an area because they are more likely to be able to connect back into family and friends, that extra work spent on this will pay larger dividends because of their unique situation. Family independence, critically important, because this is a group that doesn't identify as homeless. They're highly motivated to not be in the homeless system. And again, when we go back to direct city provision, there already is contacts and staffing that are working directly with families and dependents. And so by just sort of aligning a bit with the current work with those staff, you could really reduce the number of families that are entering your homeless system. And largely, unlike the social aspect I mentioned, family independence largely are transactional. Largely what families need is money, is very transactional supports, which this system is very good at delivering. And then finally, veterans. This is a case. It isn't a large component of the homelessness within the population in Brantford. However, the federal government does have programming and funding to support veterans. It's a priority for the federal government. And so I'm recommending that you align with by identifying this as a priority population, you'd be able to rapidly reduce the number of veterans homelessness and could provide an early win for the entire project. And again, just to finish how I started, it really comes down to persistence, determination, and the willingness of your partners in order to achieve functional zero. However, functional zero is 100% achievable in this community. Thank you.
Thanks for your presentation, Mike. And now I'll ask if any of the committee has questions. We have about a minute left, and then we'd have to extend again if we want to. Go ahead, Councillor Miller.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Couple questions. I'll just say you had me at fiscal conservative, just so you know. I want to ask about methodology. You talked about speaking with city staff. You talked about talking with some of our partners. Did you interview or talk to the homeless, or did you rely on, say, the PIT survey?
Yeah, so this was not an extensive consultation process, and I did not have an opportunity to speak with any of the people who are actually accessing the service, and I did rely on the PIT count and research.
Okay, and then the second question I want to ask, and maybe this might be a staff question, but for social services, a lot of our money comes from province, comes from the feds in certain funding envelopes, and I just wonder how much flexibility do we have to move money, say, from the shelter, homeless shelter, to some of the suggestions you had, or do we have to take certain funds and just strictly use it for shelter, for homeless shelters? So do we have flexibility there with those funding envelopes to implement this?
Good morning, Mary Musson, Senior Director of Community Services and Social Development. Through the chair, we have some flexibility. The funding that comes from the province through the Homelessness Prevention Program funding and through the federal government for the Reaching Home funding, there are program guidelines attached to the funding. So we do have to follow the overall program guidelines, but usually there is enough flexibility within it where we could move funding that is currently delivering emergency sheltering services or homelessness prevention, and we could move it into programs that do after housing supports or homelessness prevention prior to eviction.
Okay, thank you.
And with that, we've actually passed the time again. So if there's additional questions, it's up to the committee if we'd like to extend the time for another 10 minutes. Councillor Oakley, and is there a seconder for that? Councillor Miller. Oh, I didn't see. Okay. And so with that, all in favor? Okay, so we'll extend for another 10 minutes. And next I have in line Councillor Oakley.
Thank you. To the presenter, a few questions here, primarily on the theme 4 in relation to the County of Brant. So you specify in here that opening small shelters in small communities is expensive. would you still be considering, you know, Paris, for example, is a municipal, or is a town right now of roughly 17,000 people, and within the provincial forecast over the next 30 years, we're looking to become a city of roughly the size of Woodstock. Would you still then say that that would be inappropriate to have a shelter in a community of that size at that point, or somewhere in between here?
So just to qualify, so I wouldn't say that it's inappropriate to have a shelter. I'm saying it's not appropriate to approach a shelter first. And so there may become a point if other measures have been taken, and that's part of that fiscal conservative piece. Like, if you already have assets available, let's try and access and utilize the assets before we move to a shelter. Because once you open a shelter, you're likely going to have that shelter, because the capital that you place in the shelter and then actually the cost of running the shelter will very quickly, you'll be spending a lot of money on it. So it's not a preferred option. And it will create animosity in the community where you decide to place the shelter. NIMBYism will, I've yet to see anyone celebrate opening a shelter in their community. It's just never happened. No one ever says thank you for opening a shelter. Even if they say they're going to say thank you at the beginning, they definitely won't say thank you once the shelter is open. And so looking at that broadly, then I would say that if there's an opportunity to address the needs of the community through prevention work and better outreach to the community and ensuring that people understand what's available to them, I'd say that's a better option initially. And then if that fails and you're not able to see the reductions, then opening a shelter may become a possibility.
Okay. And if I may ask a follow-up, I would agree with you that probably very likely the community would not say thank you, but I would argue that probably the people who utilize the shelter would say thank you in that instance, which is the point. But to move on to sort of the next point there, then, you know, transportation then will become very important, moving people to and from the county and the city. Would you then say that more than likely an important part of implementing this strategy would be ensuring more frequent and more reliable transit opportunities between the county and the city, particularly in the county's larger urban areas like Paris, St. George, Burford? You know, right now with our current transportation offerings, there's quite a few barriers. You know, you have to get onto an app, call, so on and so forth, versus just being able to go to a bus stop and catch a bus. So would you say that's very likely going to need to be part of implementing this successfully?
Yeah, I think transit is a critical piece. I would suggest and recommend actually that taxis be used. If someone is in critical need in an emergency, then I would actually send them by taxi to the city shelter to ensure that they arrive. I wouldn't just hand people a bus ticket and say it's down the corner. But I think in general, being able to access the urban center from the rural community utilizing transit, it couldn't hurt. But specifically for what I'm speaking to, if someone came to me and said they were in need and we weren't able to identify any other place that they could stay, I would ensure they're safely traveling. We also have the what people, it's outside of this report, but what we found, the migration from rural community to city is also a touch point for human trafficking. So you want to ensure, and it used to be a bit of a bigger thing when the way the buses work, but people will come in. And when I was just running my shelter back in the early 2000s, there were people, I had to stay in my shelter, I had no outreach, but there were people waiting at the bus terminal who were waiting specifically for people to arrive by bus. Because I used to call it my bus station challenge. You could go as someone who with no experience in homelessness, you could go to the local bus terminal and watch people come off the bus. And I guarantee you 100% correct, you would be able to identify someone who's never been to the city before. And there's people who are just actively waiting for that person to walk off the bus. And I would say they offered the same thing, a place to stay, something to eat. They'd approach and say, oh, come over, smoke a joint, you stay at my place. And we even had people who would enroll these kids into schools in order to either sell drugs in the schools or to recruit in the schools for human trafficking. And so I would say very clearly, if we're sending someone, safety is paramount. for this particular, if someone was in that kind of need, I would send them directly to the shelter, and I would ensure that the shelter knew they were coming and that there was space available, so they wouldn't also just show up by taxi and get turned away at the door. That's all part of the coordinated system, which really you already have in place. That wouldn't be much. It would just be ensuring that for transportation, it's direct to the shelter. But I don't think having a good transit system is bad. But for particular around this case, direct transport is better.
All right, with that, now we have Councillor House and then Councillor Carpenter.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair, to Mike, I was paying attention to your statistics at the beginning of your presentation, which are certainly impressive, and obviously one of the tactics within your strategy is to as you said, improve the social relationships for the people who are potentially in need for shelter, and so that they don't need shelter. But I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more anecdotally on kind of what's the secret to that, because it does appear fairly obvious that, you know, if we can get somebody to stay at mom and dad's or at their aunt or uncle's house, it's gonna save them from coming into the system. But can you give us an example or two of different ways of achieving that people aren't generally thinking of?
I think largely it's an intention. So it isn't that these options haven't always been available. It's just that we really don't avail ourselves of the option. And so actually just before this presentation, I was having a conversation about, we used to have a young person who was staying in Welland. We found them housing in Welland, and then they'd show up on the weekend and come into our shelter and stay over the weekend, and then they'd return to their housing in Welland. Before we had our shelter diversion program, if you came to the shelter, we just assumed you needed the shelter. We didn't, that was just sort of obvious in the fact that you were approaching the shelter. And so we never even thought to ask, is there somewhere else, or do you actually need the shelter? We just, you know, that was, if you came, you must need. And so it was a real awakening for us when we started just asking the question, do you need the shelter, or do you have somewhere else to go? And so that was how it started. We weren't necessarily anticipating the family and natural support connection. At that time, we were largely thinking there are just other places you were, like, as I described, like you maybe had an apartment you were paying rent for, but you're accessing the shelter, or you've come in from out of town and are now in St. Catharines. You have places to live in Hamilton or where have you, and instead of using up a shelter bed in our city, we'll just send you back to Hamilton or Toronto, wherever it is that you are actually from, instead of just coming and staying for a night in St. Catharines in our shelter. Through the process of asking, that's when we identified that when we asked people, where could you go? The majority of people said, well, actually, there are family and friends that I could return to. And so it's not just about, on our side, it's not just about saying, oh, you can go back. We confirm you can go back. And so it's a matter of we phone up the person you said you could stay with to ensure that, in fact, they will let you come stay. And that's only when we would have someone go there. And again, safety is paramount. We're always very concerned about any kind of domestic violence or abuse. And so this is why when you have a shelter diversion worker, they need to be quite skilled, because they need to be able to understand the nuances. It's not about saying no, it's about saying what's best. And so if we feel that maybe you can go back home, but home maybe is abusive, we'll just bring in the shelter, even though you said there is a place you could go to. So really it was a learning experience. It wasn't we knew that we had to figure out a way to reduce the number of people coming in the shelter to make sure that the shelter is working effectively. It was only through running the program that we came to the realization, because that's what people told us. And so that's how we've come to that. It really came down to asking a question. And I'm kind of embarrassed that we never asked that question for 15 years.
Thank you.
So Counselor House, that brings you to the end of your 4 minutes. Did you want to go back in the queue? Okay, thank you. And now I have Counselor Carpenter for the last minute here.
Okay, you said the community has to come along, or does it work? What did you mean by that?
Sorry, I missed the first part. Was it
You said in your submission that the community has to come along to reach functional zero. What do they mean by that?
and so when I think about the work that I've done in my career, I started off as a shelter provider. And the work that I've really done has been to put myself out of business. And so if, you know, it's that old adage, you know, if your only tool's a hammer, all your problems are nails. And that's really what the shelter system is. It solves a problem, but it makes all the problems the same, because that's what it's designed to provide. It's designed to provide beds. And in order to supply support, people have to stay in their beds. This forces people to have to actually come into the shelter. And because the shelter is a physical space, it also forces them to physically come to wherever you place the shelter. And so the majority of the homeless system is shelters. These are the main actors within the homeless sector, are shelter providers. And so as a shelter provider, potentially it's difficult because people believe the work they're doing. I'm not thinking that anybody is providing shelter who thinks they're harming anyone. They really believe that shelters are the answer. And so what you get then is bringing the community along really requires, how do you work with shelters to see that sheltering might not be the best answer? And that's largely going to be the struggle.
It doesn't really identify who the community is, but why do you think people don't like
Sorry.
shelters in the neighborhoods?
And so I believe the community are the main actors in the homeless sector, which are shelters.
Okay,
That's largely who I meant.
the government and the staff. Okay, why do you think shelters aren't welcome in neighborhoods and in communities?
I think people, I mean, there's lots of stigma around homelessness. It's largely, and if you had, you know, just like the safe consumption sites we've recently had about not wanting them near schools and not wanting.
I'm sorry, we're gonna have to pause there. We're a little over the 10 minutes and I need to find out if the committee would like to extend for an additional 10 minutes, noting that that requires a 2/3 vote. All right, moved by Mayor Davis. Is there a seconder? Councillor Oakley, okay, and all in favor? We are extended, thank you.
There's apprehension largely. Usually when people look to open shelter, it's in an area that's usually commercial urban, tends to be places where people like to try and place shelters away from residential, or in communities that largely have been disadvantaged within the city. So lower income communities largely are areas where shelters, because there's a feeling that they will less upset the neighborhood, and largely the tax base that then will call you, Mr. Mayor, with complaints are the people in largely the middle income or higher income neighborhoods. And so largely this is where shelters end up being placed. And that's why I think neighborhoods largely don't like shelters, because of the stigma. There can be very good, I mean, well-run shelters with very little impact, but the apprehension is there.
You don't think it's because wherever the shelter is, then the people in the shelter are pushed out in the daytime and they're circulating in the neighborhood causing problems? Do you not think it has a lot to do with how the shelter itself is managed?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are ways to run a shelter where that isn't the case, very well-run shelters. But that really will depend on, but I think even before anyone knows that might happen, if you went into a community and you went around to the neighborhood and asked people, would you like a shelter opened in your community? I think you'd have very few people that would say, yeah, this is something we'd like to see in our
Because
neighborhood.
they would go and visit the shelter nearby and see what's going on in that neighborhood, where the houses and boarded up and broken windows and so forth. Okay. In your report, you also mentioned that.
Councillor Carpenter, I'm sorry, you're well over your 4 minutes. Would you like to go back in the
I don't know where
queue?
you get the 4 minutes from, but it's not a regulation.
Do you want to go back in the queue?
If I could finish, yes. Yeah,
Okay.
there is no such thing as 4 minutes in public delegations. Okay, so, the other, 74% of mental health and substance abuse, that's the majority. So if I take your 1% analogy for homelessness, that would be 1,300 for this community. And 74% of the mental health and substance abuse. We don't have a full addiction treatment center for that. And when we don't have people that are going into shelters and then being attached to addiction treatment. Have you seen that model work anywhere? But I don't see it across the country.
Mental health addictions is a real issue in the community. I would point though, although there is a high level of mental health and addictions within the homeless community as a percentage, when we look at the number of people who have serious mental health and serious substance abuse issues across the Canadian population, we find that if those were direct causes of homelessness, we would expect to see much larger numbers accessing the homeless shelter system. And so the majority of people with serious mental health and addictions issues are housed. And so specifically on my report, I'm speaking from the lens of homelessness. And I'm not a mental health expert. I'm not an expert in addictions. And again, I think there's definitely room for improvements in both the delivery of mental health services and addiction services and treatment. However, we can't let that take us off the housing focused. And so if we're spending our time working on substance abuse and addictions and we're not looking to house people and we're keeping people in facilities, I believe ultimately that's detrimental to the goal of reducing homelessness.
And one final one, 33% of the people is because rents are too high. So just to follow segue into what you've been saying. So you feel that, and the same thing as the food banks. For example, people say to me, why are the food banks in such a great need? Well, my view of it is, and you can correct me on this, as also a question, is that the rents are so high, people are paying all the money in rent at food bank because they don't have money left over to eat because the landlord's taking all the rent money. And the rents are so high because we haven't been building housing for 50 years and we have people that are renting houses. The demand has pushed the rents up. So do you see that as an example right across in all the work you do in other areas?
Yeah, and housing is kind of interesting when you think about it. Because we have this idea of affordability, and affordability is really a subjective, it's how you feel. So it's how much of your money do you want to spend before you feel that's an affordable thing or that thing is unaffordable. I mean, I'm not an economist. I'm not sure if rents per capita based on what people are bringing in. I'm not sure how much higher or lower we are traditionally. What I can say, it isn't so much the housing, but the housing benefits, OW, what we allow for housing benefit hasn't kept up with the market. That's really been, and so if you look across, especially recently, there was an AMO report around the municipalities that looked into homelessness. And if you saw that municipalities are largely relying on rent subsidies now in order to allow people to be able to afford housing, where before the municipality was able to rely simply on OW because the OW rent portion was enough. However, that rent portion hasn't kept up. And it's now we're backfilling with rent subsidies.
In fact, there hasn't been an increase in OW since 2018, right?
Exactly. So I think there's probably enough housing if you could afford it.
All right, and with that, we're going to move on to Mayor Davis for questions to ensure everybody has a chance to ask questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to Mike, thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. The philosophy you have, which is, the zero, the housing first, trying to find options other than shelters. Much of that amounts to, as you say, diverting the person or persons out of the shelter system or keeping them out of the shelter system by kind of social work approach, connecting them with their support system, whether it's family members in another community or friends, whatever. Actually, our housing staff have been doing a really good job of that. There's been a greater emphasis on that the last 4 or 5 years, diversion. We have actually increased the number of staff who do that, which is essentially social work at its core. And that probably is why we have reduced our waiting list, or at least part of the reason why we reduced our waiting list from about 1,500 down to closer to 1,000. But I also know from the data that's in your report, the PIC report, and also the data that we get from our encampment team, that at any one time, there's anywhere from 70 to 110 people who we can't bring them into the system because one, either they just simply refuse, right? Or they've come into the system before, but the behavior is either so violent or so disruptive that they cannot be accommodated in the shelter system, or even in wraparound support system, supportive housing, and their family members and support system they had before in their life wants nothing to do with them, right? So what do you do with that core group that either refuses services or the services that we have, even supportive services, doesn't come anywhere near to addressing it's usually a severe substance use or a severe mental illness, severe depression or severe psychosis. What do we do?
And I'd just like to, again, as I mentioned off the top, the work that has been done in your community through your staffing has been excellent. And that's the reason why I believe that there are the ability to move forward. So all kudos to the work that's happened. Great steps have been happening here, very innovative. Yeah, and I mean, that's the heart, right? There is a group that largely the system has left behind. And so the first thing to do is try and prevent that reality from continuing. And that's largely the work that I would suggest in the working with people, preventing people, not bringing people into. One of the reasons why people don't want to work with the system, because they've been through the system so many times and they never got the help they needed. And so they've given up on the system, and they've learned how to survive on the street. There's this, it would take much longer for us to have this discussion, but there's this thing called a homeless identity, which is a true identity where people then, their social norms that go along with being homeless. And that's truly once you cross that line and you've sort of assumed an identity of homeless, this is largely the group that you're talking about. We have had great success using housing focused work in outreach, where instead of having to bring someone into a shelter before we start having those conversations, we've been able to start having those conversations wherever people happen to be, recognizing that there are people that have completely, either they're not allowed back in the system or they don't want to return to the system. And then ultimately, I think you could look at some transitional supportive housing, I think becomes the next stage to that. But that's an investment. And like I said, I like to start with, are there things we currently are doing that we could do better? And then once we've sort of agreed that, okay, this is the group, the work, the interventions we have in place aren't satisfactory, then I think we can look at additional investments, which I largely believe would be some kind of supportive housing.
I appreciate that, which is, I agree with you, prevention is the way to go. But in the meantime, what do we do? So for example, you have someone that has severe psychosis and we see them on the streets and you can't bring them into supportive housing because the kind of mental health service you can provide in supportive housing doesn't even become close to addressing their severe psychosis, which usually takes long-term residential care. What do we do? Because the people expect municipal representatives and municipal elected officials to have the answers. And we're struggling.
And it is largely beyond your control. This is really a provincial mandate when it comes to health. We do need more health care, specifically around addictions and mental health, addressing these issues. Treatment would be part of the answer. And that's what I'm saying, like, I can't create more funding to do the work, and I have to be a realist in my work. And so I look at what I have available to me to do the work. The answer would be, there should be more treatment for people in the community, and that's working with, and I try to get at this in the report when I recommend that you need to work with the hospital system. There needs to be communication there where we're looking at and saying, okay, we both have this issue. Instead of us just bouncing people back and forth between the emergency room, hoping they become formed and that you hold them for 3 days, and the hospital system concerned about making sure that people are moving through quickly. because they're tracked on how people move through the system. They have time, the province sets on them. So this creates a situation where you can get people caught between the two systems. And so that's where I would say, before we start spending money, obviously, if we had the money, that would be great. But I would say, let's talk to the system and see if there are ways, because there is money in the system. That's what I'm trying to say. There's money being spent. And there are efficiencies that can be had. So instead of just spending more money, let's make sure we're spending money efficiently, and that requires communication.
I'm sure I can just ask one more question.
Yeah, so at this time, we'd need to extend again for that one more question.
I'll move we extend.
Okay, and your seconder is? Councillor Oakley, and all in favor then? Do we have? We are extended for your final question, Mayor Davis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for that. And thank you, committee members, for extending so I can ask one more question. Mike, what do we do? Now I'm talking about a situation that we experience, and so does Hamilton and London and Toronto and Ottawa, where you're surrounded by municipalities that of similar size that don't even have one shelter bed. And their way of addressing homelessness is to chase people out of their communities. What do we, and our funding doesn't reflect that from the province. We don't get more funding. What do we do?
So that was part of the shelter diversion and part of the appropriate people in your shelter system. Part of being appropriate is that they're residents of the community that you are mandated to serve. And so if people are coming to your community that aren't residents, I would suggest that you look to bring them back to the community, which is their home community. And this isn't just, we're only going to work with the people, we're only going to spend our taxpayer money on people in the community. That's an argument. However, I think there's a larger social argument in that if you come to this community and you have no one in this community, you don't have a job prospect, there's no family here, you have no knowledge of the community, and you come as homeless, chances are you're going to end up being in the system for extremely long. So it makes sense then to be able to transport people back to the communities where they are residents, where they do know people, where potentially they may have jobs. So I'd say you're doing a better service to people working to make sure they get back to their community. That's how I'd respond. I'd ensure that people in your shelters are the people that are residents.
All right, thank you. And seeing no further questions, at this point, I'll thank you for your presentation, and we'll be discussing this matter soon. All right, could I get a mover and a seconder to place item 5.1 on the floor? Moved by Councillor Miller and seconded by Councillor Carpenter. All right, any discussion? Go ahead, Mayor Davis.
Yeah, so we're back to receiving this report, correct? Yeah. So I'd ask a question through you to staff. Have I missed something? I see the report that we have as a staff report attached to our agenda. Did we receive Mike? Do we have Mike's report? Sorry, Mr. Lefty's report.
Through the chair, yes, we do have the consultant's report, which I could circulate to members of Social Services Committee afterwards.
Okay, great, thanks. I also noticed in the staff report, that was touched on, and Mr. Lefty talked about how it doesn't make sense as the first response for smaller adjacent communities like Paris to set up a shelter right away. Is there, I guess the basic question though, is there homelessness in Paris, in the county?
Through the chair, what I would say is with the knowledge that we have from the pit count, yes, there is homelessness in the county of Brant. However, it is probably more hidden than it is currently in the city. What the AMO report is saying, and even what our pit count is showing, is that homelessness is increasing in rural areas. So to extrapolate that, it will get more intense in the county. So what staff are looking at right now is how can we start putting in more of the prevention supports into the county to prevent the need to open up an emergency shelter in the county right now.
Right, and so how would you do that in the county? Like, would you set up a branch office of like SOAR, similar to what they do here, in East Ward?
Yeah, through the chair. So we already have Ontario Work Service coordinators in the county on a regular basis. So it would be leveraging those assets and those office spaces and then increasing the presence. So very similar to the staff who currently do encampment outreach in the city is expanding encampment and street outreach into the county to provide those supports. And then these staff would be the linkages to financial supports and housing supports and anything else that a person who's currently residing in the county might need to stabilize their housing and prevent homelessness.
Right. But if somebody in Paris needs shelter, they're gonna come to Brantford.
Correct. And we already have that system in place. So there's someone experiencing homelessness who needs to be placed into the emergency shelter. SOAR Community Services does do the intake to the Brantford shelters, and they do have a system set up very similar to what Mr. Lethby suggested, where a taxi would be provided so that they could access the correct shelter.
And the county, because this is a joint service, they pay their proportionate share of the shelter costs. And so we're working together as a group to deal with homeless in the entire region.
That is correct.
All right. And part of our solution, future forward-looking solution is, of course, Fox Ridge and developing Fox Ridge, which will be the first time that the municipality owns and operates a shelter. How do we see that working together with the county, and who will be there, and how the capital and operating costs will pay? Or is that premature?
Through the chair, that is a little bit premature. However, staff are starting the background work and we are anticipating bringing a business case forward in Q2 of 2025. So I'm anticipating June of this year to more readily answer those questions, because it is very important that we make sure that both the county and the city are served well by Fox Ridge.
My last question is, if there's a constituency in the county that would like there to be a shelter in the county, how would we accommodate that?
So through the chair, we would have to really look at data-driven solutions and really determine whether or not putting a shelter is the correct answer, or if homelessness supports through staff is the first step. And like Mr. Lethby was saying, that we try the least intrusive intervention, but if it's not working, then we ramp up to more extensive interventions.
My last question. So with.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor Davis,
I'll hold it back.
do you want to go
Sorry.
back in the queue?
Yep, please.
Okay. And we'll move on to Councillor Miller, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I like the report. I like the fact that it seems very common sense, right? You try and prevent people from getting in the shelter, in the first homeless shelters in the first place. My question is to staff. If we approve this today, you're going to take this back, craft a plan, and then come forward later on. And if that's approved, and I know a lot of the recommendations, social services have been kind of aligning that way anyways. How long would it take to if approved, how long would it take to implement the recommendations from the report?
And so through the chair, that's a very good question. What we're intending right now is to take the recommendations from Mr. Lethby's report and really look at it on how we could create a 5-year roadmap with the next Brantford Brant Housing Stability Plan. And so it would be, this is just one piece of the entire housing system. So we really need to look at housing right from homelessness, where someone is unhoused, all the way to home ownership. And we really need to fit this into our housing stability plan for the next 5 years on how it serves the communities the best.
Yeah, okay, so I got that. It's not a one and done, it's part of the process. And okay, thank you. Good answer.
Councillor Oakley, go ahead.
Through you to staff, just to pick on one thing you said there about, so we are using taxis to get people from where they are direct to the shelters, which Mr. Lethby explained why we should do that, which is good. My curiosity would be in regards to getting county residents into Brantford. Have we been using because the county is already subsidizing Brant Transit, utilizing that service rather than independent taxi company, which then would be an additional cost, or has that not been coordinated at this point? Because it would make sense to me that we would use a service that we're already subsidizing in that case, since it functions similarly.
So through the chair, so SOAR Community Services, they're responsible for delivering this service. So I'm not specifically sure as to whom they've contracted their taxi services through, but they do have accounts with local taxi companies.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and before we move on to second time speakers, I'm going to just, Counselor Carpenter, go ahead. I didn't see you. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. So the diversion process, so when you talk about this county, we're talking about the city of Brandon, city of Brantford, we are one entity as far as social services go. So diversion does not mean that we divert from one to the other. It's from others. It's diverting people back to the cities that they came from, outside of the county of Brantford, city of Brantford. That be correct?
So through the chair, yes, diversion is a very broad word because anyone who can be diverted from accessing shelter is a positive win for this system itself and for more importantly for the individual. So locally it'd be diverting people back to safe family or friends or safe accommodations, but it's also correct diverting people who do not have any connection to the city or county back to a home community where they do have supports. It's very important for people to be able to access those supports, and if they have no connections to the city or county, it's best served to repatriate them to their home locations.
And some of the diversion would require a skilled social worker to discuss with the individual why they are in need of the shelter. So they would have to have experience whether maybe they're being sexually abused at home, and maybe they don't want to disclose that, or when they do disclose that, do we also defer for services for that, or do we get anybody else that needs to be involved in regard to the legalities of what is being disclosed?
Yeah, so through the chair, like when a person accesses the emergency sheltering, there's very skilled staff who are social workers who do motivational interviewing to determine why a person is homeless in the city or the county. We have other tables as well set up. So one example is the Encampment Network table that meets on a weekly basis. And they discuss people who are experiencing homelessness in the city and the county. And there's a 99% chance that they have touched one or more systems. So these are community partners like Ontario Works, ODSP, Grand River Community Health, community paramedics, and we discuss people and their situation. And usually because of the consents that are in place, we can share the information and paint a better picture of what that person is experiencing so we can actually put the most compassionate and most appropriate resources in place for them.
Okay, and Foxwood was mentioned. So as far as Foxwood goes, have you consulted with the neighborhood around Foxwood for their concerns?
So through the chair, we're just starting the consultation process right now with community partners. So no, we have not reached out to community members, but we'd be very happy to hear any of the feedback that they have.
Yeah, you're say happy to hear, but are we going to have a public meeting to discuss the issue with the residents in the area?
So through the chair, we have not had a public meeting yet, but that's something we can discuss.
So the question is, are we going to?
So through the chair, we can take that offline and I can discuss if that's something the ward councilors would like to set up. We can definitely do that.
And running the shelter in that location, it's not going to be like the shelter we have downtown where the residents are pushed out in the daytime and they're all over the neighborhoods. We're not going to have the same kind of rules and regulations, are we?
So through the chair, none of our shelters exit people in the mornings. All of our shelters are 24 hours a day, so people are welcome to stay within the shelters. A lot of folks do choose to leave in the mornings because they have different, some of them are employed, some of them have different appointments they need to attend, but none of our current shelter providers require them to leave the building.
But hanging around the neighborhood or sitting on people's front porches and things like that will not be permitted.
So through the chair, there is a good neighbor policy already in place for our shelters. And yes, we would be enforcing that up at Fox Ridge too.
And the consultation will take place. There's no intent at this time, or there's no funding, I guess, for addiction services, treatment services to be attached to this facility.
Through the chair, no, the application for the Heart Hub that SOAR Community Services had put in and that City Council endorsed was not successful. So no, there is not.
So, and that application was to the province?
Correct. That was the application made to the Ministry of Health.
And that was not successful.
That is correct.
Thank you.
And Counselor Howell's your hands down. Do you still want to go ahead?
No, thanks. I withdrew my hand.
Okay, thank you. All right, and with that, I'll just make a couple of comments myself. So I wanted to say that I really appreciate the recommendations in the report, specifically the idea of moving away from our reliance on emergency shelters towards more long-term solutions like supportive housing and transitional housing. I also wanted to highlight the fact that I was really pleased to see that we're looking at having more of a focus on the social connection and actually having our contracted services outlining how they'll be prioritizing and integrating social connection into their service delivery. I think that's going to be very valuable. In addition to that, something that really stood out to me was the idea of reaching out in the high schools to anyone that could be at risk of experiencing homelessness to really stabilize and have social connection before they become homeless, just because that's a real opportunity, as the other report that we had before us today actually mentioned that 43% of people experienced homelessness before they were 24 and 29% under 18. So I think that there's a real opportunity to intervene at that time. So I just wanted to thank everybody for that report, and I look forward to seeing these recommendations integrated. Thank you. And now we'll move on to Mayor Davis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Following a comment that was made, I think by Councillor Carpenter, in reference to the Heart Hub, that was there was a large advocacy effort on my part, other councillors, also city staff. Yes, unfortunately, our municipality was not selected, or SOAR was not selected. Their application was not accepted, but we continue the advocacy. We continue the lobbying, and I'm led to believe that depending on what's in the provincial budget that will come down the next month or two, that there may in fact be a stage 2 of the Heart Hubbing. So we're keeping our fingers crossed and hoping that happens, and continue to advocate and lobby, not assuming that it's one and done and you didn't get approved, that it's never going to happen. I don't think that's the case. So we're operating on that assumption, just for the benefit of the community. So I have a question for Mary, kind of following on the questions I was asking you, and I'd like to know a little bit more about the community surrounding us. We've talked about the county, and we're in it together, and we do it together, but what about Six Nations? Do they have a shelter diversion system?
So through the chair, I don't know directly if they have a shelter diversion system. There is one shelter on Six Nations. However, the populations who can access it are limited. So just for an example, if there are men who might be assaulted to their partners, they would not be able to access the shelter. So there is very limited resources on Six Nations.
Great. That's primarily a family sort of oriented shelter, isn't it?
That is correct.
Right. And how many beds or units do they have?
I'm not quite sure about that.
Right. What about our biggest neighbor to the south, which Haldimand Norfolk? They do their services jointly as well, don't they? Social services. I think you're saying yes.
Yes, they
All
are.
right. And their combined population is actually greater than the city of Brantford.
That's
Do they have
true.
even one shelter bed down there?
That is correct.
Do they?
And to the best of my knowledge, they do not have shelter beds.
Right. And okay, so do we find that there are people coming into our system that are from Haldimand Norfolk?
Yeah, through the chair, like we do have people who are coming from Haldimand, Norfolk, and I do know that shelter staff or intake staff do try and repatriate them as much as possible. Oftentimes what we also find is that they have exhausted all the resources they can access in their home communities. And so the compassionate thing to do is to provide as much support as possible, but they have been essentially relocated.
All right, so, all right, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
All right, and with that, I want to thank the committee for this wholesome discussion, very thoughtful questions. And with that, we'll call the vote on this item.
All those in favor? Carried. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. And there are no resolutions, no notices of motion. So at this time, we are adjourned.